It was a quiet, sunny afternoon in a suburban neighborhood. A man in his early 50s, dressed in a sharp suit, was driving through the streets of his neighborhood. He was a respected judge in the local court system, known for his calm demeanor, his sharp mind, and his dedication to justice. As he cruised down the peaceful street, the hum of his luxury car's engine was the only sound filling the air. The neighborhood was quiet, with trees lining the sidewalks and families enjoying the warm weather. The judge's thoughts were far from the usual busy workday ahead. Today, he was simply trying to enjoy the calm of the afternoon as he drove home. He had spent most of the morning in court, making important decisions. And now, as he turned the corner, he was looking forward to the peace of his home. He hadn't anticipated any problems or interruptions, but that's when it happened. Without warning, a police siren blared behind him. It was startling, and he instinctively looked in his rearview mirror to see the flashing lights of a patrol car. He hadn't done anything wrong, so he didn't understand why he was being pulled over. His mind raced briefly as he slowed down and steered his car to the side of the road. The judge had been pulled over before, but never like this. There was no reason to feel nervous, but as the officer stepped out of his patrol car, something about the situation felt different. The officer was a white woman, in her mid-30s, with a stern look on her face. She walked toward his car with a noticeable air of authority, but there was something in the way she moved that made the judge feel uneasy. Her uniform was neat, her belt loaded with gear, and her hand was resting on her holster as if ready for something to happen. The judge rolled down his window and waited for the officer to speak. He smiled politely, but her expression remained serious. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, her voice firm but not unfriendly. The judge, a man who had spent years navigating the complexities of the law, nodded calmly. "No, officer, I don't," he responded. His voice was smooth, measured. He wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, and the officer's behavior wasn't setting off any immediate alarms, though he could sense something wasn't quite right. Without offering an explanation, the officer began to ask for his license and registration. The judge complied, reaching for his glove compartment and handing over the documents. As he did so, the officer's eyes flickered over him, scanning him with what seemed like a mix of suspicion and something more difficult to read. She didn't respond to his polite inquiry about the reason for the stop, simply standing there, staring at him as if trying to evaluate him in a way that felt unnecessary. The judge, still maintaining his calm composure, was becoming more and more puzzled. There was no obvious reason for him to be pulled over. He wasn't speeding, he hadn't run any red lights, and there were no visible signs of trouble with his car. He was a well-known public figure, and he carried himself with the confidence that came from years of professional experience. Yet the longer the officer stood by his car, the more he felt something strange in the air, an underlying tension that was hard to explain. A minute passed before the officer spoke again, and when she did, her words took him by surprise. "Step out of the vehicle," she said. Her tone had shifted slightly, now more forceful than before. The judge's heart rate picked up, and though he knew he had done nothing wrong, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had been in the legal world long enough to know that when things didn't add up, you had to be extra cautious. He could sense that this wasn't just a routine traffic stop. There was something more at play. He took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped out of the car. The officer's eyes never left him as she stood a few steps away, her posture still stiff, her hand never leaving the side of her holster. The judge kept his hands visible and tried to maintain his calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if he was asking out of genuine curiosity or because he was beginning to feel uncomfortable with the situation. The officer looked him over once more before speaking. "You're driving a car like this. Do you really think you can afford it?" Her words were sharp, and the judge was taken aback. The officer's tone, now laced with judgment, seemed to imply something about him, something that wasn't about his driving or his car, but about who he was and what he represented. The judge felt a wave of confusion mixed with frustration. He was aware that this was not just about a traffic stop anymore. It was about something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words, but it was there. It was in the officer's eyes, in the way she spoke, and in the way she looked at him, as if he didn't belong in the world he had worked so hard to build. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. The judge, who had spent years working within the confines of the law, trying to uphold fairness and justice, was now the one being judged unfairly. His heart raced, but his mind remained sharp. This wasn't just an ordinary traffic stop. Something bigger was happening, and he could feel it. The officer was making assumptions about him, and those assumptions were rooted in something far darker than just this moment. He knew he had to stay calm. He couldn't let the situation escalate, but in his gut, he also knew this was only the beginning. The judge straightened his shoulders, preparing himself for whatever came next. The encounter was about to take a turn no one could have predicted. The officer's words hung in the air, heavy and filled with judgment. "Do you really think you can afford this car?" she had asked, her tone more accusatory than anything else. The judge stood there, momentarily stunned, unsure of how to respond. His luxury car, a model that had been carefully chosen to reflect his status, was now the source of suspicion. He had never been one to flaunt his success, but it was clear to him now that the officer's question wasn't really about the car. It was about something much deeper. He took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. This wasn't just about the car, and he knew it. It wasn't even about the traffic stop. It was about his identity as a black man in a world where people like him often faced assumptions and prejudices based solely on how they looked, what they owned, or where they came from. He had spent his entire life defying these stereotypes, working his way up from a difficult childhood to becoming a respected judge. Yet in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. The officer's gaze remained cold and distant as she eyed him with a mix of suspicion and disbelief. He could feel the tension between them growing thicker with each passing second. The judge knew he couldn't allow himself to be dragged into a confrontation, but he also knew he couldn't ignore what was happening. The unfairness, the judgment, it was something he had experienced far too many times before, and yet it always took him by surprise. "Is there a problem with my car, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying an edge of frustration that he couldn't quite hide. He was trying to keep his tone civil, but it was becoming more difficult as the seconds ticked by. This wasn't the kind of encounter he was used to. As a judge, he had dealt with all kinds of situations, from petty crimes to high-profile cases, but this felt different. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a long look at him, almost as if she were deciding whether to believe him or not. The way she looked at him, with a raised brow and a slight sneer, made the judge feel like he was on trial, as if his worth as a person were being measured against the car he drove. It was disorienting and insulting, but he wasn't going to let her see how much it affected him. "Are you really a judge?" the officer asked suddenly, her voice tinged with skepticism. She hadn't asked for his name or badge number, just launched into her own line of questioning. The judge's mind raced for a moment. How could she doubt it? His black robe, his long years of service, his reputation. It should have been enough. Yet here he was, standing before her, being judged not by his actions or his position, but by her own biases and assumptions. "Yes, officer, I am," he replied, his voice still calm, though there was a slight edge to it now. He didn't owe her any explanation, but he couldn't help but feel the need to assert his identity. He wasn't just a black man driving a fancy car. He was a judge, a professional, someone who had earned every bit of what he had. The car wasn't a symbol of arrogance or excess. It was simply a reflection of his hard work and success. For a moment, the officer didn't say anything. She seemed to consider his words, her eyes flicking between his face and the car. Then, to his surprise, she spoke again, this time with a touch of contempt in her voice. "Well, I guess you'll have to prove it then," she said, as if making him jump through hoops was somehow justified. The judge was taken aback by her response. What did she mean by prove it? It was clear now that this wasn't about his car or his driving. It was about something much deeper, something rooted in prejudice. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was an open display of racial bias. The officer had already decided who he was before even giving him a chance to explain himself. "Prove what, exactly?" he asked, his voice rising slightly, though he was still trying to keep his composure. He wasn't angry yet, but the sense of injustice was growing stronger with every word she spoke. "I'll need to see your ID, and I'll be running your name through the system," the officer said, her voice still laced with doubt. It was as if she needed to confirm his identity, as though the idea that a black man could be a judge was something too foreign to accept without question. The judge nodded, trying to hold back his growing frustration. He reached into his pocket and handed her his driver's license, though he knew it wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't matter that he was who he said he was. In her eyes, his identity wasn't enough to clear the assumptions she had already made about him. The officer took the license without saying another word and walked back to her patrol car. The judge stood there, fuming inside but doing his best to stay composed. He couldn't believe what was happening. He had spent so many years fighting for fairness and justice, and now, in the middle of his own neighborhood, he was being treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. As he stood there, waiting for the officer to return, the judge couldn't help but reflect on all the times he had been forced to prove himself. Time and time again, he had fought against stereotypes and discrimination. He had worked harder than most to make it to where he was, but it seemed that for some people, none of that mattered. The officer's actions, the way she looked at him, spoke volumes about how deeply ingrained prejudice was in society. The judge knew that the outcome of this situation was far from certain. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger, about the systems that perpetuated inequality and the people who still refused to see beyond the color of someone's skin. And he was determined not to let this moment slip away without standing up for what was right. The minutes felt like hours as the judge stood by his car, waiting for the officer to return. His mind raced with thoughts, each one a mixture of frustration and disbelief. How could this be happening? How could someone in a position of power, someone who was supposed to serve and protect, treat him this way? It wasn't just the traffic stop. It was the insult, the assumptions, the way she had questioned his worth simply because of the car he drove. The judge was no stranger to challenges. As a black man, he had fought his whole life against stereotypes and prejudice. But this moment felt different. This wasn't just another day where he had to prove himself in a world that often doubted him. It was a direct challenge to his dignity. The sound of the officer's footsteps brought him back to reality. He looked up and saw her walking back toward him, a blank expression on her face as she held his ID in her hand. He wondered briefly if she had found something to justify her actions or if she was simply stalling to make him feel small. His hands clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. He had been through too much to let this moment break him. The officer stopped in front of him, her gaze fixed on him. "Everything checks out," she said in a tone that didn't seem entirely convinced, almost as if she was reluctantly admitting that he wasn't who she had expected him to be. But the words didn't bring relief. They didn't erase the sting of what had happened. It wasn't just about the paperwork. It was about the way she had treated him. He nodded, but he wasn't going to let her get away with this. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge. "But I'd like to know why I was stopped in the first place. What exactly did I do wrong?" The officer didn't immediately respond. She seemed to hesitate, almost as if she were trying to find the right words, but he could tell that there weren't any. There was no valid reason for this stop, no legitimate explanation for the way she had acted. She had judged him, not by anything he had done, but by the assumptions she had made about who he was. I thought I saw you driving suspiciously," the officer finally muttered, her words sounding weak even to her own ears. It was the kind of excuse that anyone could see through. The judge wasn't buying it. Suspiciously, he asked, raising an eyebrow. "And what exactly does that mean? Are you saying I was speeding, running a red light, doing something illegal?" He didn't mean to sound accusatory, but he couldn't help it. The entire situation had become absurd, and now the officer's attempt to justify it seemed even more ridiculous. The officer shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable under his gaze. "No, but it was the car. I mean, it's a very expensive car. And, well, you don't usually see people like you driving one of those." The judge's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak right away. Her words stung, but he didn't want to let her see how deeply they affected him. This was the core of it, the assumptions that had been made based on the color of his skin, the car he drove, and the judgment that followed. It wasn't about him being a judge, a professional, a person who had worked hard to achieve everything he had. It was about the idea that he couldn't possibly belong to that world. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking at the officer, trying to make sense of everything. "So let me get this straight," he said slowly, each word measured. "You pulled me over because you assumed I couldn't afford this car, simply because I'm black. And that somehow made me suspicious." His voice didn't raise, but there was a sharpness to it now. He wasn't just asking questions anymore. He was making a point. The officer's eyes darted around, avoiding his gaze. She looked guilty, but still not quite willing to admit the full truth of her actions. He could see the way she was struggling, the way her mind raced to justify her behavior, but it was clear she wasn't going to get away with it. The judge wasn't going to let her sweep this under the rug. He shook his head, his frustration growing. "I've spent my entire life proving that I belong. I've worked harder than most to get where I am. And yet, here you are, treating me like I'm some kind of criminal simply because of the car I drive. You don't even know me, officer. You don't know who I am, or what I've done. And yet you're making assumptions that are not only wrong but harmful." The officer opened her mouth to say something, but she didn't have the words. The judge could see it, the realization that she had crossed a line, that her actions had been unjustifiable. But it wasn't enough. The damage had been done, and it wasn't just about this single encounter. It was about the bigger picture, the countless times black people were treated unfairly based on the color of their skin. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern, one that was far too familiar. After a long pause, the officer finally spoke, her voice quieter now, more subdued. "I'm sorry," she said, the words sounding hollow. But the judge knew it wasn't just about saying sorry. It was about change, about recognizing the deep-seated prejudice that led to this moment and doing something to address it. He nodded, but his expression remained firm. "Sorry isn't enough," he said, his voice steady. "But I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." With that, the officer reluctantly handed back his driver's license and stepped away, not saying another word. The judge stood there for a moment longer, the weight of the situation still pressing down on him. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The judge stood in place, watching as the officer walked back to her patrol car, his mind still racing. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, as he tried to process what had just happened. He had expected an apology, perhaps, or some kind of explanation, but what he received felt more like an attempt to dismiss the entire situation. It wasn't enough. He couldn't let it go. This wasn't just about his personal experience. It was about something much bigger, something that affected countless others who had been in his shoes. People who had been judged based on assumptions, people who had been made to feel less than simply because of who they were. As he stood there, waiting for the officer to finish with whatever she needed to do, the judge thought about all the times he had been pulled over in his life. Times when he had been questioned, treated with suspicion, or looked at with doubt. It wasn't just a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was about the color of his skin. He had learned to deal with it, to push through the frustration and the hurt, But moments like this brought all those old feelings rushing back. The anger, the disbelief, the exhaustion of constantly having to prove that he was worthy of respect. The officer returned to her car, taking her time as she moved around, not quite looking at him. He could tell she was uncomfortable, unsure of what to say next. The words she had already spoken hung in the air between them, leaving a bitter taste that wouldn't go away. The judge knew it was time for him to take a stand, to make it clear that this kind of treatment couldn't continue. He couldn't ignore the reality of the situation any longer. He had been given the power to make decisions in a courtroom, to determine the fate of people who found themselves in difficult circumstances. He had worked tirelessly to get to this point in his life, to earn the respect he had as a judge. And yet here he was, being judged by an officer who had no idea who he was or what he had accomplished. The injustice of it all stung, and the more he thought about it, the more it angered him. With a deep breath, the judge stepped forward, his footsteps firm and deliberate. He wasn't going to let this moment slip by without saying something. As he approached the officer's patrol car, he caught a glimpse of her looking at him through the rearview mirror. She seemed unsure, almost nervous, but he wasn't interested in making her feel comfortable. This wasn't about her comfort. It was about standing up for what was right. The officer turned around as he neared, still avoiding his gaze. "Is there something else you need, sir?" she asked, her voice strained. The judge took a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Yes," he replied. "I think it's important that we have a conversation about what just happened. You can't judge a person based on assumptions. You can't look at someone and decide what kind of person they are based on the car they drive or the color of their skin. That's not how the world works, and it's not how things should be." The officer shifted uneasily, but the judge wasn't backing down. What happened here wasn't just about a traffic stop. It's about how people are treated, about how people are labeled before they've even had a chance to prove who they are. I've worked my entire life to get to this point. I've worked hard for everything I have. But none of that matters when someone like you looks at me and sees something else, sees a stereotype, sees a threat, sees someone who doesn't belong. That's the real problem. The officer stood in silence, the weight of his words settling between them. The judge's voice remained steady, but the anger and frustration behind his words were undeniable. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me," he continued, his voice softening just slightly. "But you did, and I'm not the only one who's been hurt like this. This happens all the time. People are judged by the color of their skin, by what they drive, by where they live. It's wrong, and it has to stop." The officer finally looked at him, meeting his gaze for the first time. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of something in her eyes. Maybe regret, maybe realization. The judge didn't know, and in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had said what needed to be said. He had made it clear that this kind of behavior would no longer be tolerated. It wasn't just about him. It was about making a stand for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for everyone who had ever been judged based on their appearance or their background. It was about standing up for justice, even when the system itself was flawed. "I don't want an apology," the judge said, his tone firm. "What I want is change. I want you to understand that what you did today was wrong, and I want you to do better. Not just for me, but for everyone you come into contact with, because people deserve to be treated with respect, no matter what they look like or where they come from." The officer nodded slowly, her lips pressed together in a tight line. She didn't speak, but the judge could see that she was processing what he had said. He hoped that it would stick, that she would leave this encounter with a deeper understanding of the impact of her actions. As the judge turned to leave, he felt a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about winning the confrontation. It was about making sure his voice was heard. It was about ensuring that this moment would not fade away into the background, that the lesson would stay with both of them, no matter how uncomfortable it was. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but every small step mattered. And today, he had taken one. As the judge walked away from the scene, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. The brief but powerful confrontation with the officer had sparked something he hadn't expected. He had stood up for himself, but more importantly, he had stood up for something much bigger than his own experience. He had fought not only for his own dignity, but for every person who had ever felt the sting of being judged unfairly. He wasn't sure what the officer's response would be. He had spoken his truth, but he wasn't naive enough to think that one conversation could undo years of ingrained biases. The judge had seen it too many times in his courtroom. Prejudices that people tried to hide, the way decisions were made based on appearances rather than facts. This wasn't just about the officer who had pulled him over. This was about a larger system, one that needed to be confronted, one that needed to change. As he got into his car and drove away from the scene, the judge thought about the many moments in his life when he had been judged without being truly seen. He thought about the first time he entered law school, the way some of his professors had looked at him with skepticism, as if doubting his ability simply because he was black. He remembered the subtle glances and the whispers when he began his career as a young lawyer, and even the way some of his colleagues had hesitated before giving him the benefit of the doubt. But he had worked hard to prove them wrong. He had earned every bit of respect he received, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. But there was something different about this encounter. It wasn't just the officer's actions that bothered him. It was the realization that the officer likely wasn't alone in her thinking. This was a pattern, one that stretched beyond this one incident. It was a systemic issue, rooted in biases and assumptions that ran deep. And if he wanted to make a real difference, he knew that it wasn't enough to simply confront one officer. He had to speak up, not just for himself, but for the countless others who were treated unfairly based on the color of their skin or the way they were perceived. That night, as he sat in his office, the judge reflected on what had happened. He realized that he had a unique opportunity, not just as a judge, but as someone who had experienced discrimination firsthand. He could use his position to speak out, to make people understand the weight of their actions, to encourage others to stand up when they witnessed injustice. But first, he had to figure out how to do it in a way that would make people listen, in a way that would truly make a difference. The next day, the judge arrived at court early, as he always did. He sat in his chambers, thinking about how he could address the issue in a way that would resonate. He didn't want to make a grand speech, but he knew that sometimes the smallest actions could have the biggest impact. He decided to start with a conversation, just as he had done with the officer. He would speak to his colleagues, his staff, and anyone else who would listen. He would use his position of authority to lead by example, to show that standing up for what was right wasn't just a personal choice. It was a responsibility. As the court day began, the judge saw the familiar faces of lawyers, defendants, and witnesses, all going about their business. He had presided over countless cases, some of them heartbreaking, others inspiring. But today, he had a new purpose. He wasn't just here to rule on cases. He was here to make a statement, to make sure that everyone who stepped into his courtroom understood the importance of fairness and equality. During a break in the proceedings, he called his court staff into his office. They gathered around, curious about the sudden request. The judge looked at them seriously, his voice calm but firm. "I want to talk to you all about something important," he began. "It's about how we treat people, especially those who come before us. We have a responsibility, not just as members of this court, but as members of society, to ensure that everyone who walks through those doors is treated with dignity and respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." The room fell silent as the judge continued. "I know we all do our best to be fair, but sometimes the biases we hold inside can influence our decisions without us even realizing it. I'm not immune to it, and neither are any of you. But what matters is how we act when we recognize those biases. We have the power to change the way people are treated, to ensure that justice is truly blind, as it's supposed to be." The judge paused, letting his words sink in. He could see that his staff was listening, but he didn't expect them to fully understand just yet. It was a conversation that needed to be had, one that would take time. But this was the first step. He knew that addressing these issues head-on, in his own courtroom, would send a message to everyone in the building, and perhaps beyond it, that things needed to change. As he walked back into the courtroom, the judge felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a figurehead. He was a part of the system, and it was up to him to help make that system better. The small interaction with the officer had opened his eyes to the broader issues that still needed to be addressed. It wasn't just about one traffic stop. It was about a lifetime of experiences that could be changed, a lifetime of prejudices that could be broken down. It was a fight that was far from over, but the judge was ready to face it head-on, one step at a time. The judge had felt a shift within himself after the confrontation with the officer, and that feeling only grew stronger as the days passed. His thoughts were consumed by the incident and its aftermath. The officer had been dismissive, and while the judge had stood his ground, he couldn't stop thinking about how many others had been treated in the same unfair way. There had to be more than just words. Actions were necessary too. It was not enough to simply reflect on the issue. He needed to make real changes. His position in the court system gave him a unique power. He had the authority to make decisions that affected people's lives, and he understood the weight of that responsibility. But with power came responsibility, and he realized that he could use his platform to address the systemic issues that plagued the justice system, issues that went beyond his own personal experience. He had spent years working within the system, but now he had to challenge it. One evening, as he sat at his desk, surrounded by piles of case files, the judge realized he had been avoiding something. He had been so focused on the incident with the officer that he hadn't considered how to bring these important issues to the people who needed to hear them the most, his fellow judges. He knew that change would never come if they remained silent or refused to see the problem. He had to act, not just in his own court, but on a much larger scale. The judge began to prepare a speech, one that would address his colleagues and hopefully open their eyes to the biases and prejudices that shaped their decisions. It wasn't an easy thing to do. He understood that many of them would resist, that they would feel defensive. But he also knew that silence and inaction weren't options. The system needed to change, and it had to start somewhere. The day finally came when the judge would address his colleagues. As he entered the courtroom, he felt the weight of what he was about to do. He had seen the way they interacted with one another, the subtle nods, the quiet conversations about cases that seemed to slip through the cracks. He had watched as people, often from marginalized communities, were treated differently, often more harshly, simply because of their appearance or background. It was a pattern, and it was one that needed to be broken. As the court session began, the judge stood up and requested everyone's attention. He had already prepared them for what he was about to say, but he could sense the tension in the room. Everyone fell silent, waiting for him to speak. "I want to talk about something that's been on my mind for some time now," the judge began, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "We, as judges, hold an incredible amount of power in our hands. We have the ability to change lives, to impact the future of the people who come before us. But with that power comes a responsibility that we cannot take lightly. We are responsible for ensuring that justice is truly blind." He paused for a moment, scanning the room. He could see the skepticism on some faces, but he wasn't about to back down. This was too important. "I've been in this system long enough to see that there are biases, even in the most well-intentioned of us. And those biases can affect our judgments, our decisions, our actions. We cannot pretend that they don't exist, and we cannot continue to ignore the damage they cause. This is not just about me or my experience. It's about every person who walks into this courtroom, every person who is judged not by the facts, but by their appearance, their background, or their race." There was a long silence in the room. Some of the other judges shifted uncomfortably, while others seemed to be lost in thought. The judge knew he was challenging them, but that was the point. Change wouldn't come if they remained complacent. "We need to start talking about this openly," the judge continued, his voice firm. "We need to have these conversations, not just among ourselves, But with the people who come before us, we need to listen to their stories, to truly see them as individuals and not just as cases. If we don't, we are failing in our duty. We are failing in our responsibility to provide fair and impartial justice. The room was still, but the judge could sense that something had shifted. It wasn't a dramatic change, not yet, but it was a beginning. Some of the other judges nodded in agreement, while others remained silent, perhaps considering what had been said. The judge knew that this wasn't something that could be solved in one speech or even one conversation. It was a long-term process that would require persistence, patience, and most importantly, action. After the meeting, the judge felt a sense of relief, though it was mixed with uncertainty. He had done what he could, but he wasn't naive enough to think that everything would change overnight. There would be resistance, there would be arguments, and there would be moments when it felt like nothing was moving forward. But he had taken the first step, and he had spoken up. That was something. The next day, he found himself thinking about how much work there still was to do. He knew he couldn't do it alone. This wasn't just about changing the minds of a few judges. It was about changing an entire system. It would take time, but with determination and a collective effort, it was possible. The judge wasn't giving up. He couldn't. Too many lives depended on it. As he returned to his office, the judge felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but he was ready to face them. He had spoken the truth, and now he would continue to fight for justice, no matter the obstacles in his way. As weeks went by, the judge continued his mission to bring awareness to the biases that existed within the justice system. He had made the first step in speaking up, but now the real challenge began. He had started a conversation, but for it to have any lasting effect, it needed to become more than just words. It needed to lead to action, and it needed to create lasting change. The judge kept working in the courtroom, listening to cases, hearing testimonies, and making judgments, but his mind was constantly focused on what he had started. He couldn't help but notice small changes in the way his colleagues were interacting with one another. There were conversations that had previously been silent, but now people were talking. Some of the older judges who had been dismissive of the issue at first began to ask questions, to wonder aloud about how their own decisions might have been shaped by biases that they hadn't even realized existed. One morning, he found himself sitting in his office, looking over a particularly difficult case. It involved a young man from a disadvantaged neighborhood who had been caught in a robbery. The evidence against him was weak, but the police had been eager to charge him. The judge had seen this before, the assumption that someone from a rough background was more likely to commit a crime. It was a bias that ran deep in the justice system. As he read the case file, he found himself thinking back to his own experiences. Growing up, he had faced his own share of prejudice, and it was easy to see how that same prejudice could affect a judge's decision. It wasn't just about the facts. It was about how the facts were presented and interpreted. It was about how society saw people like the young man in the case. The judge made his decision. He ordered a retrial, insisting that the young man deserved a fair chance, freed from any assumptions based on his background. It wasn't just about that one case. It was about showing everyone in the courtroom that biases couldn't dictate a verdict. The judge was determined to set an example. Soon after, something unexpected happened. His decision to speak up about bias and fairness began to spread beyond the courtroom. News outlets picked up on the judge's bold stance. What had initially been seen as a single speech grew into a movement. Other judges started speaking out too. They shared their own experiences, their own realizations about how the system wasn't as fair as they had once thought. They acknowledged that there were flaws, but they were ready to fix them. One evening, the judge received a letter from a woman who had attended one of the recent sessions. She thanked him for his courage in speaking out. She shared how her own life had been affected by the justice system, how her brother had been wrongfully convicted and sentenced because of racial prejudice. The woman told the judge that she was now hopeful that things would change, that people would start to see the truth and take action. Reading her words, the judge felt a wave of emotions. He had no idea that his small act of speaking up would lead to this. But the real turning point came when the judge was invited to speak at a national conference on justice reform. It was a huge honor, and he knew that this was his chance to make an even bigger impact. He spent weeks preparing for his speech, carefully considering the points he wanted to address and the message he wanted to send. He wanted everyone in the room to understand that change wasn't just about one judge or one case. It was about all of them, working together to rebuild a broken system. When the day of the conference arrived, the judge walked onto the stage, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never spoken to such a large crowd before, but he knew that what he had to say was important. The room fell silent as he began to speak. "It's time for us to acknowledge the truth," he started, his voice strong. "The justice system we have today is not just flawed. It is fundamentally broken. Too many people have been hurt because of the biases that have been built into it. We can no longer pretend that the system works for everyone, because it doesn't." He paused for a moment, looking around the room. There were judges, lawyers, and law enforcement officers in the audience, all of them listening intently. "We have a choice," the judge continued. "We can continue to ignore the issue and perpetuate the injustices that have been allowed to fester for too long. Or we can face the truth and start working together to fix it. It will be hard. It will be uncomfortable. But it is the only way forward." The audience was still, but the judge could see that his words were resonating. He could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders, but he was no longer afraid. He had made the decision to act, and now he was ready to take the next step. When he finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't just applause for his speech. It was applause for the movement that had begun. It was applause for the recognition that change was needed, that the justice system couldn't continue as it was. That evening, as the judge walked back to his hotel, he thought about everything that had led him to this point. He had started with a simple, personal encounter, an incident that had shaken him and made him question the very system he had spent his life working within. And now, that encounter had become something much bigger. He had sparked a conversation, started a movement, and made people realize that the fight for justice was far from over. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the judge knew that there would be many challenges along the way. But he was no longer just a judge in a courtroom. He was part of something bigger, a movement that was determined to bring real change to the justice system, a movement that would not rest until fairness and equality became the standard, not the exception. The journey was far from over, but the judge knew that with every step, the world was a little bit closer to justice, and for that, he would continue to fight, no matter how difficult the battle.